I'm now going to introduce Rachel. It would be a bit strange if she introduced herself. And I'm allowed to do this because one day a week I work at Hamish Hamilton, which is an imprint of Penguin, and we are lucky enough to publish Rachel. And so I was there in the office a little while ago when the new book came rolling in, and I was one of the first to be able to hold it. We were all very proud. So, Rachel Lichtenstein is an author, an artist, a writer, oral historian, and curator. As many of you know, she's the author of Rudinsky's what's that called? Rudinsky's Whitechapel, is it?
Rudinsky's Whitechapel was the Archangel project.
Oh, okay, because I recognize Rudinsky's room.
Yes.
Keeping Pace, A Little Dust Whispered, and co-author with Ian Sinclair, the highly praised Rudinsky's Room. I'm sure some of you have that on your bookshelves. And in 2008, On Brick Lane, which was a gorgeous book about that street, which was shortlisted for the Ondaatje Prize. Tonight, as you know, she will be reading from her hot off the press, Diamond Street, The Hidden World of Hatton Garden. And it's funny, I knew this book was in the works, and I knew that I just couldn't do anything to do with Hatton Garden because the expert was already taking care of that. And it's already had a fantastic review in the Times. The book officially launches in London on Thursday, the 7th of June. And yes, we're very lucky to be having a sneak preview tonight. Diamond Street is the second in a trilogy of books on London streets. Brick Lane was the first. Any guesses what the next will be? Portobello Road is going to follow. Rachel has also written essays, short stories, and book reviews for periodicals, newspapers, and radio. She is a creative fellow at Westminster University, and for the last 2 years, the people here at Medal have been lucky enough to have her running these wonderful salon evenings. So, the hometown favourite, please give a big hand to Rachel.
Thank you very much, Craig. How lovely. Yes, so Diamond Street, The Hidden World of Hatton Garden. Just like Craig, I've spent pretty much 5 years researching and writing this book. And I think all of us here tonight will probably talk about our books as being a wonderful excuse to meet all these extraordinary people and get into some very hidden and secret locations. Hatton Garden's a place I've known about most of my life. I have very long family connections to the street. For any of those of you that don't know, Hatton Garden is London's famed diamond and jewellery quarter, which sits somewhere between Holborn, Clerkenwell and Farringdon areas. And my grandfather, on my father's side, was probably the first to start trading in the street. He was a Polish-Jewish migrant who settled in Brick Lane in the 30s, and then just after the war he moved here to Chalkwell, buying one of the new houses on the Chalkwell Hall estate. But he still continued to work up in London as a jeweller and a watchmaker, and even from those early days when he had his shop in the East End, he used to visit predominantly Clerkenwell to buy findings and pieces that he needed for the watches and the jewellery trade. And then probably from the 50s onwards he was trading antiques with many of the Jewish dealers in the cafes there in Hatton Garden. And later on my Uncle Henry had a shop there, my Uncle Stanley started working there, and then later my father, and then he started his own business there with my mother, and now my husband runs that business. So it's kind of generations of the same family. So I'm very aware that I've had a real insider's kind of view of the very hidden, secretive and fascinating world of Hatton Garden through these family connections and the people that my family know and other people that they know. I've been connected up through the grapevine and got in some really extraordinary locations whilst researching this book, including the very, very close world of the London Diamond Bourse, which took a long time to set up, as kind of Craig was talking about earlier. There are a few places in the book. When I started writing the book, there was various things that I wanted to cover, and getting inside the London Diamond Bourse was one of them. Getting inside those extraordinary workshops where these amazing, mainly craftsmen, often elderly, are still working, you know, in hidden away spaces, kind of behind closed doors, behind all the glitter and glamour of the shops, these little attic rooms and subterranean spaces where you get craftsmen working and people telling you their stories, people like Dave Harris, a former diamond cutter who was working in Hatton Garden up until his late 80s and sadly died shortly after my interview with him. But he was telling me these kind of exceptional stories about how he learnt his craft at the bench as a 14-year-old apprentice, growing up in the East End as a poor kind of Jewish kid. And this was one of the jobs that was offered to that community, particularly boys in that community, go and become a diamond cutter, a jeweller in Hatton Garden. So he started working at the bench, learning off master craftsmen, you know, coming from 19th century Paris, and during that period, you know, Hatton Garden was renowned throughout the world as having the kind of finest craftsmen making exquisite pieces of jewellery all by hand. And these are the kind of stories that I wanted to capture. I'm just going to read a very tiny excerpt here about another master craftsman, a younger one, a goldsmith, whose workshop I was just fascinated by, and this gives you a kind of insight into the type of places that I was visiting. There's at least one craftsman in Hatton Garden today who still uses some of the traditional methods employed by the medieval masters of Cheapside to make his jewellery and beautiful handmade objects out of gold. His name is Gareth Harris, and he's widely regarded as one of the finest master goldsmiths in London today. The East London poet Stephen Watts had given me his contact details a number of years ago when I needed someone to fill in for me on one of my Whitechapel walks. We'd never met, but I'd heard lots about the long-time resident of Spitalfields, who, like me, is a protégé of Bill Fishman, a walker of the streets of East London. Gareth has been working for over 30 years with his business partner Dennis from a subterranean workshop in Hatton Garden, underneath one of the last remaining 17th century houses on the street. He invited me to come and meet him during his lunch hour. The tiny entranceway to their building is squeezed between two retail shops. After pressing the intercom, I entered a dark hallway which led behind the shops into the interior of one of the original Georgian houses. In front of me was a spiralling mahogany staircase which twisted up a further 3 floors. The former residential home had been split into numerous small offices and workshops, and behind locked doors, on all the floors of the building, were different businesses connected to the jewellery trade, including polishers, engravers, gem merchants and jewellery repairers. I found Smith & Harris's goldsmith workshop in the basement of the building, the bottom of a set of well-worn stone stairs. After I rang the doorbell, a heavy 5-inch thick metal door eventually creaked open, and standing in front of me, wearing a long leather apron over his work clothes, was a man with shoulder-length light ginger hair, a goatee beard and an unlined round face that made it impossible to determine his age. He wouldn't have looked out of place in any art school, and was not the grey-haired older craftsman I'd expected. He smiled warmly and welcomed me into his cramped working space below. Excited to finally meet him, I could barely look at Gareth as I entered the industrial workshop. I trained as a sculptor. His studio was a wonderland for me. Sculptor's tools in miniature covered the benches of the underground space. The walls were lined with racks filled with Victorian wooden pegs and hammers for bending metal. Wooden benches covered in tiny lathes, mini welders and heavy metal turning and polishing machines filled the room. In the huge fireplace where the oven of the former house must have once stood, sat a small forge. Above it hung a row of large metal moulds for beating out silver dishes. I've always bought tools since I was an apprentice, said Gareth, watching as I admired his incredible collection. Even when they were half a week's salary, I would buy them, so I had everything needed for whatever the job was. I've now run out of space to physically store anything else, but I can't stop looking for them. Artifacts like this are not easy to find, he said, picking up a 400-year-old swordsmith tool, which is still used and described as irreplaceable. So that's just a little tiny insight into some of the extraordinary places I was getting into around Hatton Garden. So the book kind of works in two parts. I very much wanted to capture the story of the street within living memory and to record as an oral historian, the interviews and the memories of these type of craftsmen, these workshops, an extraordinary set of skills which are starting to disappear from the area. But the other layer of the book was really like a very kind of deep, almost archaeological excavation of that place and how it's developed through time. So I spent a lot of time in the archives and wandering around the area, continuously crisscrossing the same territory to try and uncover and unpick the story of this little tiny quarter of London and how it's developed over time. So I take walks with geologists, archaeologists, Dickensian experts and various other experts in their field. I walk around to discover the story of Little Italy, the kind of first ethnic group to really arrive in the area. But one of the walks, the interviews, the explorations that took the longest time to set up and was really very exciting for me was getting down into the sewers to see the remains of the Fleet River. The Fleet River was really London's second largest river and was the reason why Hatton Garden developed, the reason why that area started to develop at all. It still flows underneath where Farringdon Road is now, starting off at Hampstead Ponds. And the more I learned about this river, I took trips above ground, below ground, I went with geologists, I found out all the stories that I could about the river, but I knew to finish the project, I had to get down there for myself. So after years, literally years of pestering Thames Water, I eventually took this trip down to the Fleet Sewers, and I'm going to read a little bit about that journey now and also show you some images taken of that trip by a photographer called James Price who very bravely came with me. So just to explain, the river now functions as a kind of storm drain, and it's in a labyrinth network of brick-lined sewer tunnels which were designed by the Victorian engineer Bazalgette. Fluid, watery channels containing the remains of the River Fleet. So, if we can put the pictures on. So I managed to take this trip a couple of years ago now. It was that time when it was very, very icy and snowy in London. And I was told on the phone, if there's any water at all gushing down the drains on the road above, it'd be too dangerous to go down, as the chance of the storm drain flooding will be extremely high. As the day of my trip grew nearer, my curiosity became edged with fear, partly because of my natural aversion to dark underground spaces liable to flooding, and partly due to a mild concern about what might be down there. Rats, of course, came to mind, along with other stranger mythical creatures. Ian Sinclair told me a story about wild albino pigs who lived in underground cells beside the Fleet, grossly fat, munching on the bones of the dead. Thornbury mentions pigsties on the slimy riverbanks in the time of Cromwell, and Henry Barton Baker describes grunters who roamed around beside the ditch of Stygian blackness and fattened on putrid garbage. Okay, so I awoke at dawn on the day of the arranged visit to a cold, dry December morning. The heavy snow that had recently fallen had just about melted away from the London pavements, but patches of black ice still covered the ground. A few dirty piles of slush sat against the curb of the embankment as I made my way from Temple Tube Station towards Blackfriars Bridge for 8 o'clock. The rest of the party coming on the expedition was standing beside 2 large white vans parked up outside Unilever House when I arrived. I waved to Diana, the geologist who was joining me, along with a photographer, a blogger and someone from the PR department of Thames Water. Next to Diana was a tall man wearing khaki waterproof dungarees, a vest and a white helmet. A crowd of about 10 men stood nearby, dressed in workers' clothes and luminous yellow jackets with the Thames Water logo printed on the back, all there to assist us on our journey. Bright orange cones blocked off part of the road, and a plastic yellow fence surrounded an open manhole cover on the pavement opposite, which I presumed we would be venturing down later. The person from Thames Water I'd spoken to had not been exaggerating when he told me how difficult and costly it was to arrange a visit to the sewers. A man with the stature of a knight introduced himself as Rob Smith, Thames Water's chief sewer flusher, and the person who would guide us underground. We followed him into the back of one of the vans, where he showed us a map of the sewers, pointing out the section of the fleet we would be visiting. He explained we had to move quickly. We only had a brief window of time before the tidal waters below reached the roof of the storm drain. A former oyster dredgeman from Essex, Rob started his career on the Cockling boats in Leigh-on-Sea and has been a sewer flusher for the past 25 years, a working life ruled by the tides. Clearly passionate about his job, the cheery 60-year-old described a great camaraderie between himself and his co-workers. Our lives literally depend on each other, and of course there is the humour, which is more than necessary in a job like this, he said, roaring with laughter, slapping his young apprentice Daniel Brackley firmly on the back. After signing the necessary waiver forms, we changed into disposable white plastic suits, thigh-high waders with steel soles, hard hats, 2 pairs of gloves, one latex, the other thick rubber, and colourful harnesses, so if we fell in there'd be something to grab us by. Rob placed a heavy gas monitor around the neck of each one of us to detect any noxious gases or low oxygen levels, and another weighty lozenge-shaped bag over our shoulders containing a 10-minute saver set with a full face mask and an oxygen cylinder, just in case you get separated from the group. Walking outside into the bright crisp morning, I saw a number of other Thames Water staff around the manhole, lowering ropes, testing equipment. Standing beside the dark void in the pavement, I strained to hear Rob's health and safety talk over the noise of the traffic, buses, car horns and loud drilling nearby. If your monitor starts to beep erratically and the lights are flashing, it means the environment below is deteriorating and we will come out sharpish, he shouted, before descending into the blackness, down a slippery vertical ladder, dripping with dark, wet matter. He quickly disappeared from sight. I followed nervously behind with a rope clipped onto the back of my harness. After a few minutes I reached the bottom of the ladder and stepped warily off into a thick, black, squelchy substance a few inches deep. Rob's voice echoed along a passageway behind me, telling me to move towards him so the rest of the group could come down. Turning around in the narrow space, I found myself in a red brick arched corridor just a little wider than shoulder width. I started walking forward into the darkness, the sounds of the sirens and the traffic above fading away, until all I could hear was the constant bleep bleep of the gas monitor around my neck, along with the noise of my short, sharp breathing, amplified by the headphones I was wearing. Adjusting the torch on my helmet, attempting to illuminate the corridor in front of me, I began to see the perfectly intact brickwork of Basildgate's sewers as I walked, out of time, through Victorian London. I stood still, trying to catch my breath, to calm my rising claustrophobia, to adjust to the extreme environment. I inhaled deeply. The smell was familiar, damp, stale, moss-like, ancient, better than I had expected. The air temperature was tepid, at times almost hot. A few feet above us, the pavements were covered in ice. Rob led us from the low level 1 junction down ever steeper and ever more slippery ladders, the excrement from the soles of our boots rubbing off on the rungs as we went down. Wandering through many low-ceiling narrow tunnels, we moved deeper and deeper underground. "Watch your step, it's a bit thick here," Rob called out from the darkness in front of us. And soon we passed a sign, the Fleet Main Line. We were getting closer. Walking across Victorian flagstones, we reached a junction where 2 tunnels converged. We continued down some stone steps, holding tightly onto a metal handrail to avoid falling on the greasy marble underfoot, before moving into another low-ceilinged and very narrow corridor. A large piece of dark, slimy, petrified wood sat on the surface. In front of us, the floor was covered in black sewage, which reached above our ankles. In one of the tunnels, Danny stopped and picked up a huge gluey white lump. "This is a fatberg, made from cooking oil and grease," he said, breaking apart with his hands the lump, which was the consistency of shiny dough with a filling of human hair. "I've just spent 3 months underneath Leicester Square, cleaning 1,000 cubic metres of fat from a blocked sewer," he said. It was the size of 9 double-decker buses. We cleared it with shovels and jet engine machinery. The last bit we really struggled with. We twisted and turned our way along many more dark brick alleyways, grateful for our kits and our competent guides. Finally we stepped on a metal gangway which cut across a large vaulted chamber. "Is that all of us, or have we lost someone?" shouted Rob cheerily over the noise of the rushing water below. As we gathered tightly together on the platform in the cave-like space, the yellow stock brick ceiling above was temporarily lit by the beams of light from our helmets as we looked around. Dark shadows moved across the walls. Victorian ghouls, Dr. Dee, many images came to mind. The roof of the chamber dripped with a sticky liquid, and small white balls were stuck to the surface, more flat globules. Our steel-lined boots echoed on the metal platform, resounding around the cavernous space as we precariously moved around. Diana's headlight shone on my previously white suit, which was covered in black skid marks by then. Either side of the Victorian gangway there were sharp drops down to the swirling waters beneath. Before descending the last ladder, which would take me straight into the fleet itself, I tried to wipe some of the slime off my gloves. Shaking slightly, I arrived at the bottom of the ladder and took my first steps into the murky, muddy waters of the former river, trying to find my footing on the curved brick floor, thick with salty river mud. Freezing water pressed tightly against my waders, quickly moving up towards my thighs, the cold seeping through the thick rubber. Wobbling in the darkness, I felt a firm hand grab my arm and saw Rob beside me smiling. Moving around the chamber carefully, my heavy boots glued to the riverbed, as if I were walking across the moon, I made my way towards the entrance of a long circular tunnel in front of us, which led up to the viaduct. The smell down there, on the bottom of the fleet, as low as it is humanly possible to be in London, was different from that in the narrow tunnels above. A familiar odour of salt and estuary mud mixed with something less pleasant, watered-down sewage, the stink of old London. We stood in silence for some time in the water of the vast chamber, the most dreamlike space I have ever encountered, admiring the incredibly beautiful brickwork, listening to the sound of the rushing water, the clanking of the giant flaps behind us gently swaying open as the river pushed past. A deep rumbling noise came from overhead as a tube train passed high above. I asked Rob if any animals were able to live down there. Nothing apart from a few rats and crabs. We see a lot of dead rats floating about. But then, of course, there are the crocodiles, he said, grinning. We chain them up when we get visitors. He laughed when I mentioned albino pigs lurking in the tunnels and wild bulls. But he did say that over the years the flushers have found something strange down there. Bones, rings, guns, even a live hand grenade. Rob had never seen a ghost, but others had in Wick Lane. He's called Egbert and wanders around sometimes. Exhilarated to finally be standing in the lost river I'd spent so long researching, I spoke enthusiastically about being there to one of the other flushers, who was equally gripped by the place even after decades of working there daily. "It's like Narnia down here," he shouted, over the immense noise of the rushing waters. "If you go further upriver towards Hampstead, the brickwork is immaculate, like it was done yesterday, all by hand, amazing workmanship. I just love this job. It's never busy down here. It's not like London. You can go anywhere you want and no one will stop you. There's not one traffic light, you can walk for miles. It's magical. Not like London." It wasn't. We were physically underneath the city but had entered a different realm. There was nothing in that space apart from ourselves to suggest we were in the 21st century. I managed to achieve something, if only for a few brief moments, which I've been trying to do since I started this project. To peel back the veil of time, to glimpse a moment of the past, to walk in a landscape of a bygone era. Thank you. I think I'll stop there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If we all sit down here, can you see us on the screens, or do you need to stand up? You can see, okay? Yeah. Well, I'd like to start by really thanking our other speakers tonight. I think we've had so many kind of rich little insights into London stories. And I just want to ask the other two, first of all, I mean, the piece that I've just read is a kind of perfect example of what a great excuse writing a book is to get into places that you wouldn't normally go to, or speak to people that you wouldn't normally speak to. Craig, can I start off by asking you about that, and where did you go, or who did you speak to who you wouldn't ordinarily have been brave enough to approach, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is a great excuse to go out into the world. I was talking to someone just a second ago during the break about how I had a terrible time when I first moved here, and I would see people on the escalators and the tubes, and I'd think, who are you? How do you do this? How do you get by here? So it was really an excuse to talk to those people, the people around the city. But then, as Rachel knows, well, as we all know, there are these places that are very hard to get to, hard to get into. So for me, there's a long section in the middle of the book where I spend a night with fruit sellers out in New Spitalfields Market, and these men who are there from midnight till 9 a.m. and who use, because the book is about language, who use a very forceful, colourful language that incorporates a lot of slang. I'm sure you all know this sort of thing, but to witness it and to see the way that they sell, the way that they deal with each other, was it was incredible, and to be able to sort of capture that, I think that was probably the best excuse I used. And it was heartening for me to see too that the older generation, mostly white men, but these younger guys coming in, were Pakistani guys and Turkish guys, and no matter where they had come from, they had to learn the old rhyming slang. They had to learn this language, and they were adding their own spins to it. So it was a vibrant, evolving language, and this book gave me an excuse to go find that.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I don't know if things are changing, but I'm still sufficiently shy and socially maladept enough to be one of those people who feels they've committed a crime by locking eyes with somebody on the underground. And I spend most of my life avoiding contact with people, and it was nice to do the opposite of that. And sometimes it does feel like an adventure. If you use the word wonderland, you think you're slightly in a daze, and especially in your case where it was coming out from darkness into light. I spent a lot of my time in darkness. You couldn't quite believe in retrospect where you'd been. But sometimes sort of stories are kind of horrible. I think one of the ones that's most imprinted in my memory is spending a lot of time with minicab drivers, and sometimes they're based in kind of the basements of corner stores, and their friends, sometimes relatives, work upstairs, and there's cameras linking both. And I was, I think it was in Kensal Rise. It's a quite rough area, and pretty much every couple of weeks, kind of just gangs of kids, 20, 25, would just come storming in, stealing, coming in with knives at anybody who might try to apprehend them. And the guys downstairs would sometimes go upstairs to help their friends, but sometimes it was too late, sometimes they were frightened. They'd call the police, but police would never come round. And later, or one night I went out with one of those minicab drivers, and at one point he just showed me his back. He took off his top, and it was like a kind of atlas of sort of stab wounds, of sort of slashes, and it was just customers or non-customers who'd robbed him, who'd attacked him. It was, you could say, it was almost like a very sort of different, violent kind of gazette of London on his back. And you think, on the one hand, I'm privileged in a way to see this stuff firsthand, to see how London imprints itself into your flesh, but it's something I don't really want to see. And so I felt I was becoming, I don't know if you felt this in your various books, sometimes you feel such a sponge for people's stories and you kind of soak them in, and sometimes it's you want to kind of irradiate yourself from them, or kind of clean yourself from them. And then other times there's something so stupid and so sort of funny that you feel that you're like a kind of panther, and you kind of walk through the streets with kind of sort of gaiety and delight, and you just want to just tell all your friends and tell all your relatives about the stuff that you've seen and the extraordinary people that you've met. So I think I absolutely agree with Craig. It can never be simply just about love, or just about a kind of a gush of PR enthusiasm. And I don't think it's right also just to say that it becomes a kind of litany of sort of sorrow and darkness as well. And how you work out the balance between that is something that I suppose every writer or oral historian or novelist is kind of grappling with.
I think you brought up lots of interesting points there, but and Craig really mentioned it earlier, you know, the amount of work and research that goes into these projects, and what's left out, and how you make those choices, and the kind of ethical decisions about the things that are left out. And you know, we're all writing about real people, and I'm always very aware how brave and generous it is for those people to kind of share their stories. I mean, first of all, Craig, just to ask you, were there a number of people that you interviewed that you felt actually it's not fair to publicly tell this story? I mean, what were the reasons that you were leaving those stories out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a great Janet Malcolm book about being a journalist, and you can't fake yourself into believing you're doing charity work. You know, I went out and wrote a book. I didn't need to do it, but yeah, there is definitely that sense sometimes of people wanting to tell these things, wanting to be heard, wanting to note their life, and there were many things that had to be cut out. There were a lot of hard ethical choices. There were sometimes when an interviewee would flip in a way from being a very sympathetic figure to divulging something that was not so great. One man that I spoke to, I'll never forget, just at the end of the interview saying, kind of Anna dying away. So why do you have a wife or anything? And he showed me an image on his phone of this very, very attractive blonde woman, and then went on to talk about the succession of Polish and Ukrainian prostitutes that he has these relationships with. And this was someone who I had spoken to for a completely different reason. And you realize that real people will never behave, they will never conform, they will never act like fictional characters. And that can be absolutely wonderful if a conversation goes off in a direction that you never thought it would, or if you learn something that you never thought you would learn. But at the same time, there are definitely moments where things are said that shouldn't be said. But you know, the nice thing about this kind of work is that you're not trying. Oh, I wasn't trying to catch anyone out, and I think that can be a real strength in oral history. It's not like working for the Sun. You don't have to go in and snatch and grab. And so I hope that, I hope that the people in the book who are real people were okay. I know that most of them were, but ultimately, you know, I was taken from their life, and I'm always kind of aware of that.
I agree. It can be really really awkward building up relationships, because you often, as I found, how people respond. First of all, at night time, partly because it's often a little bit of a sort of shadow economy. So their first assumption is that you're from a taxman. Then you might be from a home office, that you're from immigration and you're trying to get information on them. Then there's just kind of, who are you? We don't need you. They don't need charity. They don't necessarily feel redeemed. One of the things I was always grappling with, and sometimes, especially in academia, people often talk about giving voice to the voiceless. And I realised that I wasn't doing that, and they weren't demanding that. They already have voices. They talk, they analyse, they tell stories about themselves. They're on Skype at home. They're transmitting stories on mobile phones and all of this stuff. And they're taking pictures and logging and notating and doing online galleries and all of this stuff. They don't need to be kind of redeemed. I'm not a philanthropist at all. And the second part of it is the work that's involved in building up a relationship, because I thought, first of all, that I would just have just larks and kind of adventures, and I'd go out one night and meet some people, and then I'd come back beaming at my pals, and of course nothing happened. You know, they sort of scowl at you, or they're indifferent to you. And one of the challenges I found was just hanging out, doing nothing, playing pools, just sitting, shooting the shit, as they say, for days, sometimes weeks, and building up that kind of trust with people. And say 2 a.m. was very different from 3 a.m. or from 4 a.m. when you're a bit more sort of tired. I found when we're talking about things like ghosts, everybody always used to say, no, we don't believe in ghosts, ludicrous. My mates will just kind of crack up. After around 4 o'clock, 4:15, suddenly people say, well, yeah, but there was that sort of strange girl that I saw underground, or yeah, that person reminded me of this and that. Oh, don't tell anybody as well. But it takes ages to build that up, and sometimes they can't talk on the job, so they're talking in the daytime. They're talking, many of them have 2 jobs, 3 jobs. They spend their spare time pamphleteering on behalf of a local church, and so you have to catch them where they are. And they've got childcare duties and a million things going on. And to meet them, not just in their uniforms, not just kind of in the obvious context of their lives, but in their relaxation time, which they've really earned, you do become kind of implicated in their lives, and it makes you all the more, I hope, kind of sort of vigilant about what you're doing with their material. I didn't give names, I think, of almost anybody that I spoke to, and like you, Rachel, I didn't. I think I started off with photographs, but I found it just complicated things. A lot of people didn't want to be photographed, and I wasn't as competent as you and your colleagues. So I just kind of had just horrible scrapped notes. Sometimes I didn't even have a tape recorder as well.
I think it's really interesting you brought up the thing about photographs. I must admit, Craig, reading your book, I was desperate for kind of images of these people whose voices are so clear. I mean, but did you take pictures while you were doing the interviews? Was that very deliberate that you didn't? Because the other thing I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've obviously got this amazing archive of oral recordings as well. There must be such a rich box of accents and different voices. Have you thought about kind of turning that into some other media format, like, you know, with Sukdath, he's produced these kind of lovely multimedia performance pieces, and has that crossed your mind?
Not yet. The voices are wonderful, you know, and I did a book before this where I went into a village in Suffolk in 2004 and recorded a lot of the farmers and their voices too. A lot of the old farmers have died since then, but that old Suffolk accent. And in London, of course, there were just so many different voices, but the thought of doing anything with those recordings horrifies me a bit because there's another part to the recording, and that's me going, "Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Wow! Wow!" Tedious Canadian accent the entire time. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what will happen to them. But maybe that brings me to something that I'm curious about with you two. Is I mean, I get asked quite a bit about, you know, being who I am. Is that helpful or is it detrimental? And I think with, you know, both of your work, you have to, and mine as well, you have to sort of deal with who you are doing this sort of work. I can't change the fact of where I'm from or how I sound, and in some ways that can be very, very helpful, where people just think you're a weird American. They don't do that thing of listening to your accent and trying to figure out status. And I do remember one time going to a Ghanaian church. I was going to interview someone there, and I walked in, and I was the only. They were speaking in Ga, which is one of the languages in Ghana, and I was the only white person there. And about halfway through the service, the minister said, "Do we have any visitors out here?" And there was just this sea of faces turning towards me, and the men beside me made me stand up, and so I was there, this sort of beacon of Caucasian in this sea of Ghanaian, and I thought it would be very brief, and then they kept welcoming me, and then these two women, these sort of big matronly women with their lovely hats, turned around and came up the aisle going, "Welcome, welcome, welcome," and then embarked on this sort of endless song of welcome. So I often do think whether or not, you know, it's good to, well, I guess you can't change who you are, but maybe you two could speak about what it meant in your own work.
I suppose I'm torn between, on one hand, wanting to be invisible, wanting to be a sort of literal fly on the wall, but you can't be because the place has changed because you're there, and people are aware of that. They might forget it, maybe, a little bit. But you can also, so I've sometimes felt like an actor, sometimes you feel like an undercover agent, sometimes by being stupid, deliberately, or just, I am stupid, you can get people to say stuff that maybe they wanted to anyway, and that's just because of the kind of place that you're in. Maybe they're not used to talking, or maybe they think they know each other, and it's really useful to be an outsider and almost to exaggerate your sense of being just kind of blundering and asking slightly crass questions. Sometimes they just take pity on you, so they spell out things, and that's kind of great. It's better than trying to be sort of too clever and coming in with your kind of theories as if you know everything about their lives. I think it just depends on situation and context, and sometimes maybe you regret the way things worked out. But yeah, I'm always torn between kind of invisibility and the kind of, you're a kind of detonator of social and conversational possibilities.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, you know, like who you are, and do you have the right almost to investigate this story or this location or talk to those people? Do you have the right credentials? I have family connections there, that's true, and all of the streets that I'm currently writing about, there is a connection of sorts. But within this book, I really dip my toe into lots of territory that I'm not familiar with, whether that's the Fleet sewers, which I've talked about, you know, feeling very kind of claustrophobic and quite scared about going there, into that type of environment, or whether it's walking around, you know, with historians or geologists or academic experts and feeling maybe, do I have the right to look through these archives and piece together a history without even doing a history degree? Do I have the right to do this? Do I have the credentials to do this? And I think with all of us, the thing that maybe connects our work more than anything else is this absolute ferocious and deep curiosity, and just a kind of determination to kind of get to the nub of the story. And I think when I'm teaching now about writing, that's the thing that I would say to everyone. You know, you don't necessarily... I think I felt very insecure about that for a long time. You know, do I have the right credentials to even write? I trained as a sculptor, not a writer. And actually, I think if you have that respect for the people that you're interviewing, and the kind of curiosity for the places that you go to, then yes, it's valid to do so. I think at that point maybe we'll open up. Is there anyone that has any questions for anyone here on our panel? Simon?
Yeah, when you were all talking about finding out all this information, I wonder, do you kind of take on a kind of, you know, like, I'm trying to think of the right way of saying it, but
Like a different
more
persona?
you guys,
Or,
because, yeah, like, do you have kind of an act? So, you know, the first few times you try it out and it goes right, wrong or indifferent, but then you suddenly think, oh, actually, if I do it this way, it works. And I was just interested to know.
Well, one of my heroes is Studs Terkel, the American oral historian, and his whole shtick was that he could never properly use his recorder, so he'd come fumbling in and he'd get things wrong, and the recorder would be unspooling, and immediately that would disarm. I don't think he did this on purpose, but immediately it would disarm whoever he was speaking to, and they would often leap in and help him, and they were already, you know, engaged in this. But yeah, the only thing that I personally learned throughout this process and throughout some of my other work is just to catch yourself from speaking, to not say much, to allow people to go on. I think there's a thing that happens in interviews where the interviewer feels like they have to demonstrate cleverness or come in hard or be a bit of a paxman, or, you know, this kind of work is the opposite of that, where you refrain from saying too much, from asking too many questions. And listening to yourself on tape a few times allows you to do that. You realize that someone is just getting going and telling an incredible story, and you have to come in. And if you hear that a few times, you stop doing that.
Can I just say something that some of you who've been to the other salons here have met Alan Dean, who's been here a couple of times. He's really one of the greatest oral historians working in the country today, and I've been lucky enough to know Alan for about 20 years and really learned my practice through him. And he's the absolute master when giving an interview of using his body language, and he's really taught me to do it, because there is that awful thing, and I still do it all the way through, you know, umming and ahhing and laughing and interrupting when someone's giving you a great interview. And Alan just kind of gets in really close and just uses his whole body language and nods his head like mad, and the eyebrows go and the hands and everything. And he manages to do all of this and look very, very engaged without actually saying a word. And that's a great skill, actually, isn't it? One that I'm still struggling with, I must say.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes the pausing and not being scared of silence is really important. A lot of the kind of oral history or journalism you see on TV is a very short period, and they really approach people to say the things that they want them to say, and it's almost like bullet points. It's